So, welcome again to bneVideoBlog with me, Ben Aris, editor of BNE, and our editor-at-large, Liam Halligan. Liam, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Ben. Contemplating the Greek negotiations with the EU, just as you're contemplating Russia's place in the world from the St Petersburg
Economic Forum, yes.
economic summit there. It strikes me that we've reached a little bit of a hiatus this weekend in the Greek negotiation. I think everybody's taking a time out. There was a great deal of shock last weekend, of course, because the Greeks decided to bundle their payment to the IMF, something that was last done by Zambia back in the mid-80s. The Greeks now owe the IMF 1.6 billion euro by the end of June, and if they don't pay that, they're technically in default. It strikes me, though, that if they don't pay the IMF, and I don't think they will pay the IMF, because in order to do that, they'd have to give up on certain reform conditions that would mean Syriza breaking their election pledges on pensions and VAT and privatisation and so on. That's the only way they can release the rest of the bailout money from the last bailout that will allow them to pay the IMF now. You're keeping up?
Yes.
Confused? That I think that will happen. Then you'll have the IMF in some long bureaucratic procedure. The markets won't necessarily be spooked by that. That's already priced in, if you ask me. The really big deal is if the Greeks renege on their obligations to the ECB, the European Central Bank. If they do that, by law, the Frankfurt Bay institution then has to cut the credit lines that are currently keeping Greek banks afloat. That's when the
Do you think that's going to happen? I mean,
you get the civic unrest, and we won't know that until the 20th of July. I think if that will only happen if Germany decides that Greece is beyond the pale and cannot be saved. You will then have Brexit, because the Greeks will have to recapitalise their banks with something else, be it euro IOUs, drachma, chocolate buttons, whatever it is. That amounts to Brexit. That would then mean that the idea that the euro is irreversible will have gone. I personally believe that will then lead to real turbulence on bond markets as there's a lot of speculation about which country is next to leave.
Certainly, it seems like they're preparing a plan B. The Greek Prime Minister is actually sitting on stage as I speak. He started his speech by saying and asking, the poignant question. It's like, why am I here? Why am I in St Petersburg? Why aren't I in Brussels with negotiations? And then he started to talk about, in the eye of the storm and globalization and what have you. But clearly, they're here because their option they're looking at is if Russia will come and bail them out. If they leave the EU and default on all their debt, then what they'll need is not hundreds of billions of dollars, but just a few billion in order to tide the government over so that they can start the process of growth. And Russia's in a position to finance that much of it. And of course, Putin, it would be a huge feather in his cap. Part of his divide and conquer policy, if you like, of hiving off bits of the EU. And clearly, there is actually an appetite within the EU to be closer to Russia, because the whole Greek deal turns not just on a few billion in order to help finance the budget, but this gas pipeline that they've been talking about and negotiating actively today and yesterday, because that comes with cheaper energy costs, that comes with tariff income, that comes with investment, and will actually help sustain the Greek economy. So, as I say, there's been no announcement. I think it's a card they're going to keep in reserve going forward. But clearly, the EU is sort of fragmenting under this pressure.
Western coverage of Tsipras' meeting with Putin, it's a bit like a kind of snuff movie, really. Really talking about it only in low moments. A lot more coverage, by the way, for the fact that Tony Blair is in St Petersburg.
Indeed.
Legitimizing Putin's vanity summit, as much of the UK press would have it.
Well, let me speak briefly about Putin. I mean, he just gave his speech, and as I was afraid that there was no big plan announced. I mean, the sum total of what he put forward in order to get the economy going again was a few sort of tax breaks on profit tax, and then there was a whole litany of state bodies to promote R&D, state bodies to promote investment, state bodies to promote small and medium-sized enterprises, and even a state body in order to support talented Russian school children. But my take on this is that really the whole economic reform program has been suspended while Putin's in the middle of this geopolitical showdown with the West. Every spare penny is going into the military. And the plan is that by 2018, 70% of the Russian armed forces will be modernized. So I'm actually not expecting any change or any big reform plan, liberal reform plan, until at least after that point, which is kind of disappointing.
Any sign of that pipeline deal with Greece? There's been speculation that
but you know, pipeline, it's like getting married. I mean, it's a long, drawn-out negotiation, and like when you sign on the dot, there's no going back. And so, given the, you know, I think the Greeks are using it also as a card in their negotiations with Europe. They're going to say, like, you know, we're going to do a Greek exit, and if we do, not only will we go to Russia for money, but we'll actually get this huge piece of infrastructure, which will undermine your whole, you know, energy policy. So it's a very powerful card to play, and he's going to play it at the end.
I think we're just entering the real kind of twilight zone of these Greek EU/Russian negotiations. Default on the IMF is bad, but default on the ECB in the middle of July is far, far worse. And then beyond the 20th of July, when the ECB first slice of debt, 3.5 billion euros, comes due, there's the end of July deadline, which is all about will or not the EU renew its sanctions on Russia. That is a massive geopolitical question that falls in the States front and centre. I think Greece are going to game the West versus Russia consistently for the next 4 or 5 weeks. They're not just going to play their highest ranking card, signing a pipeline deal with Russia straight away.
But I mean, look at what we're talking about here. I mean, you've already referred to Greek as sort of being an African type economy. And yet this was the EU. This was like, you know, the bastion. The EU leaders are convinced that they've created the best system in the world. And here I am in Russia, where the talk has been of crisis, crisis, crisis. But from all the interviews I've taken, admittedly with big established companies, they're all like taking their stride. They're like, this is like my third crisis, my fifth crisis, and we were prepared for it. We don't have much debt. You know, raw material producers are saying, actually, we're making more money than ever. Yeah. I talked to a warehouse constructor developer, and he said, I've just done 100,000 square meters for a French retail company, and it's the biggest real estate deal in Russia's history. I mean, ever. And that was a $100 million deal with a French company. That's an amazing story.
So you're seeing the Russian economy responding to the challenge posed by sanctions by stepping up domestically.
Yeah, and the domestic companies are going forward, and actually they're battle hardened, so they see opportunity in the crisis. And other people, you know, buying land, and they're getting ready for the bounce back, and they're like, 18 months, nothing much is going to happen, but you know, we're going to recover, and demand will go on because we have this residual wealth in the ground, and it doesn't really matter what system you choose. That we're going to continue to have an income. People are going to continue to want the things that they want. We're going to continue that convergence with the rest of Europe. And really what is up in the air is the pace. You know, I think with current politics, it's going to take maybe 10 years longer than it should do. Nevertheless, they're all planning to go ahead. And it's not just raw materials. I mean, it's or construction. And the construction one is particularly positive because that relates straight to the consumer story. And there, you know, there's another setback, but, you know, Russia continues its historic convergence with the West.
Well, Ben, I know you're running out of battery there.
Indeed.
Look after yourself in St Pete. Watch out for the late nights. I look forward to seeing you here in London next week on Thursday when at Cass Business School we're pleased to be hosting our latest BNE IntelliNews event, Russia Which Way Now, featuring Ben, myself, some other interesting folk that are very knowledgeable about Russia, not least Blackwell of Emerging Market Communications. If any of our viewers do want to attend that event and they happen to be in London, you can register via the BNE website.
All the best. Good to talk to you now. Ciao.
Cheers, Ben.